She lay in the dark at Abusir el-Melek for a very long time. Then one day, strangers opened the way back to her. They did not come with prayers or gold. They came with tools and bright lights. When they finally reached her, the shock was not the linen on her face. The shock was the code hidden inside her bones. If you don't know her story, you might keep picturing ancient Egypt as a sealed box, cut off from its neighbors. You might think the people who built the pyramids sat alone in the desert. But if you stay with her, you will see the ancient world the way her DNA shows it, a place where roads of people ran through the Near East and straight into the Nile Valley. Our main character is not a queen with her name carved on a temple wall. She is a regular person who lived sometime between the New Kingdom and the Roman period. She becomes famous in a modern way, not through monuments, but through what her genome reveals when placed next to yours. Before her DNA became evidence, she lived in a corridor. Egypt sits in northeast Africa, but the Nile Valley acts like a long hallway where people travel and trade. If you live in a hallway, you do not stay untouched. Goods pass through, stories pass through, people pass through. Sometimes they arrive as merchants, sometimes as invaders, and sometimes as families looking for a better life. Her struggle, and the struggle of everyone around her, was that her home was never just Egypt. It was always Egypt plus contact. When scientists finally read the genomes of ancient people from Abusir el-Melek, they saw strong ties to populations in the Near East. The ancient genomes looked more like Neolithic Levantines and Bronze Age Anatolians than like modern Egyptians. That is not a small shift. It means our Abusir person carried DNA that sat closer to the Levant and Anatolia than many people expect when they hear the word Egyptian. Here is the trap. Many people think ancient Egyptian DNA should sit closest to modern Egyptian DNA, like a straight line connecting a grandfather to a grandson. The data shows a line, but it is not simple. Modern Egyptians overlap a lot with the ancient stock, around 80% to 90%. That is a strong thread. But modern Egyptians also have more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient sample set, about 15% to 20% more. That change matters. It tells you the population did not freeze in time. It kept mixing in ways tied to later trade and movement. So our Abusir person becomes the anchor. Her DNA is a snapshot of an older balance. It holds North African roots, and it leans toward the Near East more than you might guess. But those genetic links did not appear out of thin air. They came through real movement and real pressure. Long before the New Kingdom, people moved and mixed across Northeast Africa and the Near East. The Nile Valley was not just a river, it was a route. When roots stay open, they leave a mark on the people who live along them. Our Abusir person carries that mark. Then the story gets louder. The Hyksos arrived. History describes them as Canaanites from the Levant who entered the land as a force. Their movement is part of the long chain of contact between Egypt and the Levant. Egypt was not only trading with the Near East, it was being entered by groups from it. When people cross borders in numbers, they leave more than pottery behind. They leave DNA traces, even if later history tries to paint clean lines between us and them. Our Abusir person stands inside that messy world. She is not a pure symbol. She is a person shaped by corridors, and she is not alone. A 2025 genome from the Old Kingdom adds a specific number to this drama. In that one ancient person from Nuweirat, about 1/5 of the ancestry looked like it came from a population linked to Mesopotamia, while the rest tied strongly to North Africa. Think about what that means. That kind of mix does not happen if Egypt is sealed. It happens if Egypt is connected, and if families move along those connections. The movement was not just in bodies, it was in objects and ideas too. When pottery styles travel, it is often because people travel. The DNA and the cultural evidence point in the same direction. Now watch how our subject stays active. Her genome reaches when compared. When placed next to Near Easterners, it shows strong affinities. When placed next to modern Egyptians, it looks less like them than many expect, even though the modern population still holds most of that ancient overlap. The Old Kingdom genome from Nuweirat proves that links to Mesopotamia were not just rumors of trade routes. They show up in the blood. This brings us to the modern part of the story, where things often get ugly if you aren't careful. Modern Egyptians have more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient Abusir el-Melek genomes. This connects to increased Trans-Saharan trade, the medieval Islamic slave trade, and later migrations. That is a heavy list. It points to movement driven by commerce and power. Here is the correction you need to make. Some people hear more sub-Saharan ancestry and jump to the wrong conclusion that ancient Egyptians were not African, or that modern Egyptians are not connected to the past. The data stops that jump. It shows core continuity persists. Modern Egyptians retain about 80% to 90% overlap from ancient stock. The base stayed. The later added ancestry changed the mix, but it did not replace the foundation. Our Abusir person represents the older balance. Then comes the part many viewers expect to matter, but the data says it mattered less. Foreign invasions by Greeks and Romans. These left minimal genetic traces, preserving the Near Eastern baseline. That is a shock. Greeks and Romans are famous. Egypt under their empires is a famous story. But fame does not equal genetic impact. A ruling group can be loud in the records and quiet in the DNA. Our Abusir person lived in a timeline that reached into the Roman period, yet her genome still shows stronger ties to Near Eastern groups than to the modern Egyptian average. The baseline had already been shaped by older movements, and the Romans did not massively rewrite it. The Nile Valley acts like a long hallway. In hallways, people bump into each other. Some pass through, some stay. Over time, that creates genetic continuity with nearby regions, plus waves of new input. That is exactly what the data describes: long-standing continuity and migrations from the Levant, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia, plus later added sub-Saharan ancestry in modern Egyptians. Johannes Krause didn't walk into the lab like a man chasing a mystery for fun. He walked in like a man tired of losing. For decades, people had tried to pull real DNA from ancient Egyptian mummies and came back empty or fooled by contamination. In 2017, Krause stopped trusting easy methods. He locked the work down like a hospital isolation room. He cleaned. He sterilized. He blasted samples with UV light to destroy surface DNA. Then he drilled deep into the hardest parts of the body, petrous bones near the ear and soft tooth pulp, because those places hide DNA like a vault hides cash. When he finally read the genetic fragments, the mummies stopped being silent. You might believe mummies are too processed to hold real truth, too hot, too treated with chemicals. The reward is the twist. The DNA was there, but it demanded discipline to find it. Once it spoke, it told a story about who ancient Egyptians were connected to and how modern Egyptians shifted later. Krause faced a choice: keep trying the old way and keep losing, or change the game. He chose the second option. He built the work around sterile clean rooms. He used next-generation sequencing, which reads lots of tiny DNA pieces all at once. They looked for the scars of time inside the molecules. Old DNA breaks in certain ways. It shows damage patterns like depurination. That damage acts like a stamp that says, "I've been dead a long time." The real stars are the 90 mummies from Abusir el-Melek. dated from about 1380 BCE to 425 CE. This is not one famous pharaoh. It is a community across centuries. They lived through periods when foreign powers reached into Egypt. If you were guessing, you might expect the genetics to look like a swirling mix from many invaders. That expectation is the trap. The team found genetic continuity with minimal foreign admixture despite conquests. Across that long time span, these ancient mummies stayed genetically closer to their own long-running line than you might guess from the political headlines. A community can be ruled from afar, but still marry within familiar networks. The ancient individuals were closest to Near Easterners, especially groups linked to the Levant and Anatolia. Krauss isn't just pulling DNA out of bones. He is pulling time apart into layers. From all 90 mummies, they recovered mitochondrial DNA passed down through mothers. From 3 of them, they recovered full nuclear genomes. Getting 3 full nuclear genomes is a major win. It turns maybe into we can compare whole patterns. These mummies were long treated like museum pieces. DNA gives them back a voice, a trace of ancestry that survived heat and time. In 2017, the breakthrough changed what was possible. It validated mummies as viable DNA sources. The mummies showed continuity across change. Krauss showed persistence across failure. Now consider a different man. He didn't build a pyramid. He didn't rule Egypt. He made pots. Someone placed his body inside a Nile Valley pot at New Wayrat, sealed him in the ground, and walked away. 4,500 years later, his teeth did something no pharaoh's gold could do. They gave up a full genome. In 2025, a study turned this working man into the earliest full genetic face from that region. He was an adult male in the Old Kingdom, roughly 2850 to 2500 BCE. This is early Egypt's state-building time. He is described as a potter. That one word is a whole life. His hands dealt with clay, heat, and shape. A potter keeps homes running. He is the kind of man history usually ignores. His struggle was time. Heat destroys DNA, but natural burial without chemicals helped preserve his code. His preservation came from the way he was buried. His genome shows an ancient mix that fits Egypt's position as a crossroads. It says Egypt's early population base had strong roots in ancient North Africa, consistent with local Neolithic farmers. But it also says there was a steady thread coming from the east. About 1/5 of his ancestry links to West Asian groups tied to ancient Mesopotamian or Iranian Chalcolithic populations. That is not a tiny hint. That is a clear slice. About 80% of him carries that local North African root. The other 20% links to the Fertile Crescent. The potter's DNA tells you what kind of world he lived in. A world where Egypt and West Asia were neighbors with open doors. His mix aligns with later New Kingdom mummies, showing 80% to 90% continuity. The potter is early evidence of that deep continuity. He sits at the exact right time and place. He is Old Kingdom. He is in the Nile Valley. He is buried in a pot. He becomes the hinge between early Egypt and the wider region. The West Asian input likely came from prehistoric migrations and trade in pottery and writing. If pottery styles move, potters matter. This working man ends up changing what ancient Egypt looks like. He shows about 80% ancient North African ancestry and 20% West Asian links. He is not famous because he wanted to be. He is famous because his teeth held the past. Now we must talk about the shift. Egypt stands at the edge of the Sahara like a host who never asked for guests, yet cannot stop the door from swinging open. For more than 1,000 years, caravans crossed that desert with captives forced north. Egypt absorbed them, not with speeches, but with households and births. Over the last 1,500 years, a measurable piece of sub-Saharan African ancestry rose in Egypt's genetic profile. It went from about 6%, 15% in ancient samples to about 14%, 21% today. That is not a myth. That is a pattern written into living people. The data points to a major turning point starting in the 7th century CE with Arab conquests and continuing through the Ottoman period. Egypt became a hub. Roots crossed the Sahara. The river drew people in. Ancient mummy genomes show minimal sub-Saharan input before about 400 CE. If you expect modern Egypt to match those older samples perfectly, you are walking into a trap. The real mechanism of change was brutal: the Trans-Saharan slave trade. From the 7th century onward, it moved about 11 to 17 million sub-Saharan Africans northward. Those numbers represent millions of lives moved against their will. The choice belonged to empires and merchants. The consequence was genetic. It changed who became someone's grandmother in Egypt. Enslaved women were integrated into households, and they contributed disproportionately to maternal lineages. Maternal lineage is the mother line tracked by mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA. In modern Egyptians, sub-Saharan maternal lineages labeled L04L4 are now around 20%. That number is a fingerprint. It says many Egyptian family lines today have mothers whose roots trace to sub-Saharan Africa. The story didn't only move through men, it moved through mothers. Women were the bridge. The shift happened largely within the last 700 to 1,300 years. It's a layered change that happened while Egypt was still Egypt. Ancient Egyptian DNA is not a costume modest Egyptians either wear or don't wear. It is a base that stayed strong, with new threads added through movement and forced migration. The estimate is about 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry today compared to 2,000 years ago. Not a replacement, a blend. Imagine a young Egyptian woman in a bright lab today. She sees the colored bars on her screen. One bar is large, North African and Near Eastern roots, about 80 to 90 out of every 100 pieces. Another bar surprises her, Sub-Saharan African ancestry, around 14 to 21 out of every 100 pieces. Her DNA tells her that Egypt moved. The ancient sample from Abusir el-Malek had less of this component. The shift happened later. It matches the time of Arab conquests and the slave trade. The ancestors in this story are not one family with a fancy name. They are many families caught in systems bigger than themselves. One group faced the problem of slavery. They did not choose to migrate, but they lived, had children, and became woven into the society. The DNA gives you a clear picture. The core, North African and Near Eastern ancestry stayed strong, but a later surge added a larger sub-Saharan component. This is not everyone left and new people arrived. It is layered change. Cleopatra is remembered as a symbol of glamour, but her deeper story is that she was the face of a small ruling layer in a country whose people were not being swapped out. When she ruled over a population that had already carried a stable core through many shifts of kings. The data says the Ptolemaic and Roman rulers were small elites. Their genetic impact was under 1% in the Abusir el-Malek study. Under 1% is a few drops in a large river. Cleopatra's problem was that she was Greek, but the population was Egyptian. She could not rewrite the people by ruling them. People think conquest means replacement, but the DNA says the base population kept its North African and Near Eastern affinities. It's like a family recipe that gets cooked the same way for a long time. You can add a spice here and there, but the main taste stays. Cleopatra becomes the clearest example of a truth that feels unfair to rulers. You can hold the crown and still not reshape the people. The country kept its core. She ruled a nation that had endured. The mummies at Abusir el-Melek were supposed to be silent. Instead, they carry a signal across time. They show complete continuity across 1,300 years, even under foreign rule. Modern Egyptians still show about 80% to 90% overlap with that ancient base. The mummies do not give a clean conquest movie ending. They give a quieter ending that sticks. A population can outlast empires. The evidence survives inside a body long after names and crowns have turned to dust. Egypt is not just ruins. It is a living population with deep continuity and real change. The potter in his pot and the mummy in her wrappings both tell the same truth. Egypt was never a sealed box. It was a corridor, a home, and a destination. And the people who live there today carry that entire journey in their blood.